Hi, hello, and welcome to Short Story Saturday, where I talk to you about a short story that I read this week and annotated, and I tell you about it. All the short stories are by women authors and queer authors, and I like to dig into them as a way to try to fight the doomscrolling. So if you also want to fight the doomscrolling and get back some of your attention span, go ahead and sit tight with me and listen to me talk about this one that I read this week. Also, if you do want to participate in reading the short stories with me, next week I'll be doing Rappacini's Daughter by Nathaniel Hawthorne because it's heavily suggested that he might be bisexual due to some very close, intimate, romantic friendship letters that he wrote with another guy. This week we are talking about The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Stetson. So let's get into it. First and foremost, I won't be talking about foreshadowing because this entire story is foreshadowing. There's foreshadowing in like every single section, so I'm not going to talk about that aspect. The story essentially opens with them showing up at the narrator and her husband John showing up at this house that they rented for the duration of 3 months because the narrator, the wife, is incredibly ill and feeling unwell, and they're thinking that maybe all of this fresh air might do her well. Her husband John is a physician, and so he thinks very highly of himself and like he might have this whole illness thing figured out. And so essentially what he does is he says, oh, don't exhaust yourself, don't tire yourself. And so he asks her to not write, which is her sense of self-expression and kind of what makes her feel better. In fact, over and over throughout the story, she repeats, writing helps her mind. I mean, she repeats it 4 times, I think, in this. And I also think that she feels trapped in this because you have to understand that in this particular era, women were kind of at the behest of their husband. They couldn't really do anything. I don't remember when this is written. Let me go check that out. Whew, yeah, I was right. So it was written in 1890. So as you can see, this is not the time period where women can be writers, be expressing themselves, be going against their husband, be leaving shitty and sour marriages, which I believe that this is a shitty and sour marriage, and that John is a terrible person. Yeah. Early on in the first page, you kind of start to notice that the narrator kind of has a little bit of a twisted, morbid brain, but it doesn't start to really show until you see her full descent into madness, which if you remember reading this in 8th grade or 9th grade, which I assume most of you did because I remember that I did, it kind of involves her entire descent into madness due to being trapped in this room with this yellow wallpaper. Early on, she says, she calls the paper that she's writing on dead paper, and that's the first sign we get that her brain might be a little morbid. The next section, the first thing it talks about is how John has essentially isolated her, except for everyone but I think his sister, who's her caregiver, and then her brother John, who is also a physician, who is also calling her crazy. I'm seeing a theme of misogyny here, and calling women hysterical. And kind of some of my evidence for this super early on is the fact that one of the first lines in the entire story, by the way, is John laughs at me, of course, but one expects that in a marriage. And because of the way I annotate, I don't just annotate like the flowery language or the metaphors, the similes, all those kinds of things. I also will just write my thoughts, and next to this one, I kind of just wrote ick, because ick. So I'm again going to talk about that repetition of the fact that she writes over and over again that writing frees her mind, that John doesn't want her writing, and what is one to do about that. And you kind of see these particular phrases at the very end, and it's called, and I might pronounce this incorrectly, and so if I do, please in the comments tell me that I'm mispronouncing it, epistropher, I don't know. I can't read my own writing, but it's essentially a phrase that's at the end of a clause that is repeated off and on throughout a piece of literature. Early on, I think that the narrator really is not aware of the fact that she kind of needs certain things. I mean, I think that she's peripherally aware because she says things like, personally, I believe the congenial work with excitement and change would do me good. And so I think that a sense of purpose and a directed sense of purpose, her writing, her creativity, I think she knows she needs that, but I also think she doesn't know how to get it. She even says, if I had less opposition and more society and stimulus. And so I do think that she's kind of aware of that. But unfortunately, she can't do anything about it because of the shitty marriage that she's trapped into and because of the time period. And so she kind of begins to project her feelings and her sense of self onto the house. For example, she starts talking about how pretty the garden is outside, but then when we talk about the house on the inside, she's talking about how dilapidated and broken down and ugly it is. And so I think that she's talking about how pretty her marriage is on the outside and how flowery it looked, and then on the inside, once on the inside, it was not very flowery. I also kind of start to get the sense of zoochosis, where maybe part of her slowly being driven mad is a combination of the controlling behavior from John and being dismissed. And I think that part of it might be her marriage going sour. And I think maybe she begins to realize that at the beginning, and it becomes more and more as you read through the entire short story. She has lines like, "I get unreasonably angry with John sometimes. I'm sure I never used to be so sensitive." And John really truly is pretty controlling. So he kind of pacifies her and deals with her by shoving lots of drugs down her throat, like a lot, including tonics. And my theory throughout this, I start to kind of wonder, is he poisoning her with these tonics? Because it also mentions that he goes away pretty frequently. Is he seeing another lady friend? I don't know. That part is kind of vague in the story. Now, the infamous room with the creepy yellow wallpaper is described as a children's nursery, which, I don't know, is giving kind of haunted house creepy doll vibes. It also talks about how the fact that there are barred windows to keep the children that were in the nursery from falling out. And it also talks about rings on the walls. I don't know why there would be rings on the walls. Kind of creepy. It's giving like BDSM tying people down vibes. Now, your first look at the wallpaper is when she's kind of talking about the patterns and like some of the different things that are going on with it. It suddenly commits suicide, plunging off at outrageous angles, destroying themselves in unheard of contradictions. And it also kind of gives you a peek into the slow descent into like morbid thought that the writer is continuing to have. Now, that's the end of the first passage, and we're moving on to 2 weeks later. And it's kind of talking about how she doesn't really feel like writing anymore. It's almost like she's lost the will to fight, it feels like, because it feels like her writing is her way of living. It's her way of kind of keeping herself together and keeping herself moving forward and expressing her sense of self and creativity. You also kind of start to understand more and more how John has like warped her mind and kind of tricked her into thinking that she's a burden, to the point where she stops talking about her illness to him. She just quits talking about it. And I think one of the reasons that she quits talking about it above all else is she starts talking about the wallpaper. And I don't know if she's literally talking to him about the wallpaper, keep in mind, or if she's actually talking about like how she's feeling. But it says, "He laughs at me so about this wallpaper." Now, I also kind of think that, again, John might be a little bit of an abuser because he talks about fixing the house and making it more livable and making it more comfortable for her so that it doesn't make her so crazy. But he'll say all of these things, but then when it comes time to do it, he will also say things like, "Oh, I can't do it because we're just renting the house for 3 months." Very abuser-coded behavior. You also now kind of start to see her view of the garden changing, and she's starting to view the trees as ominous and like all of these things. And so maybe she's starting to understand that even on the outside, or like her firm grasp of the marriage all the way around, is starting to not be so good. And of course, you're getting more morbidity through the lines such as, "This paper looks to me as if it knew it had a vicious influence. There is a recurrent spot where the pattern lulls like a broken neck." Now, this is where it gets interesting, and this is my personal theory. I didn't think about this at the time, the first time I read it when I was in 8th grade, I don't think, but I think that her madness might be an outlet for her creativity. I think that her brain is so stifled and trapped because she can't do the thing that she loves, which expresses her creativity, and she already has a very morbid mind. So I have an inkling feeling that her creativity through this madness is her only outlet, and I think the madness might be a combination of both saving her and destroying her at the same time. You're also starting to see evidence of the fact that the further something is away, the more positively she thinks of it. So the further away from the house something is, talking about the wharf, talking about the road, talking about the hills, the prettier it is to her. And I think that might be because she's wanting to get the hell out. Then you have the first appearance of the figure, and it is the woman figure. And there's a front of the wallpaper and a back of the wallpaper when it comes to patterns, and they are overlaid, and the woman is trapped in between. She's beginning to talk about things such as following the pointless pattern to some sort of conclusion. I think she's trying to figure out who the woman is inside the wallpaper, what the wallpaper's purpose is, those kinds of things. And more evidence to the fact that I believe that the madness is kind of feeding her creativity as her way to keep herself alive, essentially, is how she describes the wallpaper and how she describes what's happening. Looked at in one way each breadth, stands alone the bloated curves and flourishes, a kind of debased Romanesque with delirium tremens, go waddling up and down in isolated columns of fatuity. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a writer writing. Now, I'm not going to finish my literary analysis, and the reason is I want to challenge you to go read it yourself, and even if you don't annotate, think very critically about it. And let's just say a lot of my suspicions throughout this entire thing were proven correct by the end of it, and even though it might have spoiled it for me a little bit, it is very satisfying to know that my critical reading is in fact beginning to pay off. I hope that you join me next Saturday for Rappacini's Daughter, and I hope that you read it along with me this week. Anyhow, thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Drop in the comments if you actually enjoyed. I would love to know. And do you read short stories? What do you read?